On a freezing December morning in 1887, one of Pittsburgh's most powerful men made a discovery that would shadow him for the rest of his life. When steel titan Jonathan Hartwell walked down the marble staircase of his Fifth Avenue mansion, he found his wife's emerald evening gown laid out perfectly on the Persian rug of the grand foyer, still warm as if she had just slipped out of it moments before. But Evelyn Hartwell had vanished. The front door was still locked from the inside. Every window was sealed tight against the bitter Pennsylvania winter, and not one servant had seen or heard anything unusual through the night. What made this vanishing even more chilling was that 3 different members of the household staff had seen Evelyn go to bed just 4 hours earlier wearing that exact same gown. The Pittsburgh Police Department, pressured by Hartwell's political influence, officially shut the case after a mere 6 days, claiming a lack of evidence. But the reality of what happened to Evelyn Hartwell that December night was far more sinister than anyone could have conceived. Entangled in a web of industrial espionage, buried family secrets, and a conspiracy that reached the highest tiers of Pittsburgh's Gilded Age elite. What the authorities never uncovered was that Evelyn's disappearance was simply the final act in a drama that had been playing out for more than 2 years. A lethal chess match between a woman seeking justice for her murdered father and a husband whose empire was constructed on the bones of his rivals. Before we delve deeper into the story of Evelyn Hartwell and unearth the dark truth behind her vanishing, I need you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Also, let me know in the comments which state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with our audience from all across the country. Now, let me transport you back to the winter of 1887, when Pittsburgh's steel barons reigned as kings, and murder was just another line item on a balance sheet. The winter of 1887 found Pittsburgh at the peak of its industrial might. A city where fortunes were forged in steel and coal, and where the smokestacks of countless factories painted the sky in permanent shades of gray. The very air seemed thick with coal dust, ambition, and the desperation of thousands of immigrants who had come to America seeking their destiny in the blazing furnaces of Pennsylvania's mills. It was a city of stark divides, where opulent mansions stood just streets away from squalid tenements, and where a man could rocket from poverty to unimaginable riches, or plummet from grace into a pauper's grave, all within a few months. The Hartwell Mansion stood as a monument to this new American royalty, a 4-story Gothic revival masterpiece that commanded an entire city block on Fifth Avenue. Its spires and turrets cast long grasping shadows over the Allegheny River below. The building was a tribute to excess, featuring hand-carved stone gargoyles imported from French quarries, stained glass windows illustrating scenes of industrial triumph, and a grand ballroom that could host 300 of Pittsburgh's most elite citizens. The mansion's grounds sprawled across 4 acres of immaculate gardens, greenhouse conservatories, and outbuildings that included a carriage house large enough for 12 vehicles, servants' quarters for the estate's substantial staff, and the enigmatic ice house that would later play such a pivotal role in the dark events to come. Jonathan Hartwell had constructed his empire from the ground up. He began as a common laborer in the steel mills before revolutionizing the production process with innovations that made him one of the wealthiest men in America. At 52, he was an intimidating figure with steel, gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through anyone who dared oppose him in business. His hands, though now softened by years of luxury, still bore the calluses and scars from his early days working the furnaces. A permanent reminder of the brutal world he had climbed out of through a mix of brilliant engineering and utterly merciless business tactics. Those who had known him in his youth often spoke of his transformation from the idealistic young inventor who genuinely believed his innovations could better the lives of all steel workers, to the cold industrial titan who would later orchestrate the death of anyone who threatened his dominion. Jonathan's ascent to power had not been achieved through innovation alone. In the cutthroat world of 1880s industrial America, success often demanded a willingness to employ methods that would give even the most hardened robber baron pause. Hartwell had learned early that competitors could be removed through means far more permanent than simple market rivalry. A strategic fire here, a boiler explosion there, the mysterious disappearance of a rival's key engineer. These were the instruments of industrial warfare. In an age where government oversight was minimal and law enforcement could be purchased for the price of a politician's campaign fund. His marriage to Evelyn Hartwell in 1882 had been the social occasion of the decade. She was the daughter of a prominent Boston banking family, 20 years his junior, with auburn hair that shimmered like spun copper and a laugh that could animate an entire ballroom. At 25, Evelyn possessed the refined beauty and sophisticated education that marked her as a member of New England's old money aristocracy. She was fluent in French and German, played the piano with near professional skill, and had received the finest education available to women of her standing at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. But beneath her polished exterior lay a sharp intellect and a moral compass that would ultimately put her on a catastrophic collision course with her husband's criminal enterprise. The wedding had been a calculated maneuver on Jonathan's part, designed to lend his industrial empire the social legitimacy that only an alliance with Boston's financial elite could provide. The Caldwell family's connections opened doors throughout New England's banking circles, allowing Hartwell to secure the enormous loans needed to expand his steel production and swallow smaller competitors. For her part, Evelyn had entered the marriage believing she was uniting with a man whose innovations could genuinely improve the lives of American workers, unaware that her new husband viewed human life as just another commodity to be exploited in the pursuit of profit. But by the winter of 1887, those who knew the couple intimately whispered that all was not well in the Hartwell household. Evelyn, once the radiant center of Pittsburgh's social scene, had become increasingly withdrawn over the past year. She spent hours alone in the mansion's extensive library, writing in a leather-bound journal that she kept locked in her personal writing desk, with a small brass key she wore on a chain around her neck. The library itself was a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling shelves holding over 3,000 volumes, including first editions of literary classics, scientific treatises, and an extensive collection of books on American industrial history that Evelyn had been accumulating since her arrival in Pittsburgh. The household staff, a carefully chosen group of 12 individuals, who had served the family for years, noticed that she had started taking long walks at strange hours, often returning with mud, caked boots, and a distant look in her green eyes. These walks frequently led her through Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhoods, where she would converse with the wives and children of mill workers, learning firsthand about the perilous conditions and frequent accidents that haunted the city's industrial labor force. What the servants didn't know was that these conversations were part of Evelyn's deepening investigation into the suspicious patterns of industrial accidents that seemed to follow her husband's business interests wherever they led. The Hartwell estate employed some of Pittsburgh's most trusted servants, each selected not only for their skill, but for their discretion and absolute loyalty to the family. Margaret Sullivan, the Irish head housekeeper, had managed the mansion's daily operations for nearly a decade after immigrating from County Cork during the devastating potato famine of the 1870s. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and unshakable principles, qualities that made her indispensable to the Hartwell household, but would also make her a key witness to the strange events surrounding Evelyn's disappearance. Thomas Brennan, the gruff Scottish groundskeeper, had arrived in America with his wife and 3 children in 1868, fleeing the economic ruin that followed the Highland clearances. His family had worked for wealthy Americans since their arrival, and Thomas took immense pride in maintaining the Hartwell estate's grounds to perfection. But his keen eye for detail and intimate knowledge of every inch of the property would reveal disturbing signs that someone had been using the estate for purposes far darker than anyone could imagine. Charles Henley served as the mansion's butler, a position that required him to be present for all the family's social functions and privy to many of their private conversations. Originally from Philadelphia, Henley had been trained in the finest traditions of English domestic service and prided himself on maintaining the highest standards of professional discretion. But even his carefully cultivated neutrality would be tested by the increasingly bizarre and frightening events that marked Evelyn's final months in the mansion. Dr. Franklin Westbrook had attended to the Hartwell family as their physician for over 5 years, making regular visits to the mansion to care for both Jonathan and Evelyn's health. A graduate of Harvard Medical School and a respected member of Pittsburgh's professional community, Dr. Westbrook had begun to notice troubling changes in Evelyn's behavior and physical condition during the months leading up to her disappearance. His private medical notes, which would later be discovered by investigators, revealed his growing concern about what he tactfully described as marital difficulties that seemed to be taking an increasingly severe toll on his patient's mental and physical well-being. These were people who prided themselves on discretion and loyalty, making Evelyn's disappearance all the more baffling to those who understood the rigid hierarchy and watchful eyes that governed every aspect of life within the mansion. The Hartwell household operated with the precision of a fine timepiece, with every servant knowing their exact duties and scheduled down to the minute. This rigid order made it virtually impossible for anyone to enter or leave the mansion unnoticed, a fact that would make Evelyn's mysterious vanishing seem almost supernatural to those unaware of the darker forces at work behind the scenes. The city of Pittsburgh itself seemed to hold its breath during that bitter winter of 1887, as if sensing that the very forces of change and violence that had shaped its explosive growth were about to claim another victim. The recent Haymarket affair in Chicago had sent shockwaves through America's industrial centers, and Pittsburgh's own labor movements were becoming increasingly organized and militant in their demands for safer working conditions and fair pay. Into this volatile atmosphere came whispers of a secret society of industrialists who had banded together to maintain their power by any means necessary, including the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their control over America's burgeoning industrial empire. The events of December 12, 1887 began like any other winter evening in the Hartwell household, following the precise routine that had governed daily life in the mansion for over 5 years. Margaret Sullivan would later testify to police that she had served dinner to Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell in the formal dining room at precisely 7 p.m., as was their custom. The dining room was a masterpiece of Victorian opulence, featuring a massive mahogany table that could seat 24 guests. Illuminated by a crystal chandelier imported from Bohemia and surrounded by oil paintings depicting scenes of industrial triumph that Jonathan had commissioned from prominent American artists. The meal that evening consisted of roasted pheasant, winter vegetables from the estate's greenhouse, and a bottle of French wine from Jonathan's private cellar. An 1878 Che 2 Margaux that had cost more than most Pittsburgh workers earned in a month. Margaret noted that Evelyn seemed unusually quiet during the meal, barely touching her food and responding to her husband's conversation with only brief nods and murmurs. But what struck the housekeeper as most peculiar was the way Evelyn kept glancing toward the dining room windows, as if expecting to see someone approaching through the snow-blanketed grounds. She had the look of a woman who knew something terrible was coming. Margaret would later tell Detective Samuel Crawford, her thick Irish accent heavy with emotion, like she was trying to memorize every detail of the room, as if she knew it might be the last time she'd see it. Jonathan, for his part, appeared to be in unusually high spirits that evening, speaking animatedly about a new steel contract he had secured with the Pennsylvania Railroad and his plans for expanding operations into Ohio and West Virginia. But Charles Henley, serving the meal with his characteristic silent efficiency, noticed that despite his cheerful demeanor, Jonathan kept checking his pocket watch throughout dinner, behavior that suggested he was anticipating some predetermined event to occur at a specific time. At 9:30, Margaret helped Evelyn prepare for bed, assisting her into the emerald silk evening gown that she often wore when entertaining at home, though no guests were expected that evening. This detail would later perplex investigators, as Evelyn typically wore simpler night clothes when retiring, and the elaborate gown seemed entirely unsuitable for a quiet night at home. The gown itself was a stunning creation, imported from Paris at a cost of nearly $500, with intricate beadwork that caught the light from the gas lamps and created an almost ethereal effect as Evelyn moved. Margaret specifically remembered complimenting the gown's detailed beadwork, and Evelyn had smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness the housekeeper had seen from her mistress in weeks. But along with that smile came something else that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Evelyn had embraced her, holding her tightly for several long seconds while whispering, "Thank you for your kindness, Margaret. You've been like a mother to me these past years." At the time, Margaret had been touched by the unexpected display of affection. But looking back, she realized it had felt very much like a goodbye. She looked almost relieved. Margaret would later tell the police. Like a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders, if you understand my meaning. But there was something else there too. A kind of terrible sadness, as if she knew she was about to lose everything she held dear. While preparing for bed, Margaret also noticed that Evelyn was wearing a piece of jewelry she had never seen before. A small silver locket on a thin chain around her neck. When Margaret commented on it, Evelyn had simply said it contained something precious that must be preserved. But she refused to open it or explain its significance. The locket was ornate in design with intricate Celtic knot work that suggested Irish craftsmanship, and it seemed strangely out of place among Evelyn's usual collection of expensive but understated jewelry. Thomas Brennan, making his final rounds of the estate's perimeter at 11 p.m., reported seeing a light in Evelyn's private study on the second floor. Through the frost-covered window, he observed her silhouette seated at her writing desk, her pen moving steadily across paper in what appeared to be urgent, almost frantic writing. This was the last confirmed sighting of Evelyn Hartwell alive, though Thomas would later remember thinking at the time that something about her posture suggested desperation rather than the calm correspondence that usually occupied her evening hours. What Thomas couldn't see from his position on the grounds was the scene unfolding inside Evelyn's study. The room was her private sanctuary, decorated with mementos from her childhood in Boston, and filled with the books and personal papers that represented her true intellectual passions. That night, Evelyn was engaged in what she knew would be her final act of documentation. Writing a detailed account of everything she had uncovered about her husband's criminal activities and the systematic murder campaign that had eliminated dozens of his competitors and potential threats. The study itself bore witness to months of careful investigation. Hidden behind seemingly innocent books were photographs, documents, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. Maps of Pennsylvania and neighboring states were marked with red pins, indicating the locations of suspicious industrial accidents, each accompanied by detailed notes about the victims, the circumstances of their deaths, and the business advantages that had accrued to Circle members as a result. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when Margaret arrived to begin her daily duties, she discovered the front door locked from the inside, with the heavy iron bolt that could only be engaged from within the house securely in place. The mansion's 12 ground floor windows were all latched shut, their locks showing no signs of tampering. Margaret tested each one personally, as she had been trained to do during her years of service, and found them all secure, with no indication that anyone had attempted to force them open from the outside. The second and third floor windows were too high to access without a ladder, and Thomas confirmed that all ladders remained in the carriage house, undisturbed and covered with a thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. The snow itself told its own story. A perfect, unbroken blanket of white that showed no footprints or other signs of disturbance around the mansion's perimeter. If someone had left the house during the night, they had done so without touching the ground. But it was the discovery in the foyer that stopped Margaret's heart and sent Charles Henley running to fetch Thomas from the grounds. There, arranged with almost ceremonial precision on the imported Persian rug, lay Evelyn's emerald gown. The fabric was still warm when Margaret touched it, as if Evelyn had only just removed it, and the scent of her signature lavender perfume hung in the cold morning air, like the ghost of her presence. The gown appeared to have been removed with great care, lying flat and perfectly arranged, as if it were being displayed for viewing. No buttons were torn, no seams were damaged, and the delicate beadwork remained intact. Beside the gown lay a single piece of paper, a page torn from Evelyn's private journal, with only 4 words written in her distinctive handwriting. The truth must survive. But there were other, more disturbing details that the servants noticed in those first terrifying moments of discovery. The Persian rug beneath the gown showed slight discoloration, as if it had been recently cleaned or treated with some kind of chemical solution. The air in the foyer carried not just the scent of lavender perfume, but also a faint odor that Thomas later described as medicinal, like the stuff they use in hospitals to put people to sleep. Most puzzling of all was the condition of Evelyn's jewelry. Her wedding ring, a massive diamond surrounded by emeralds worth more than most people's homes, lay on the marble floor beside the gown. But the small silver locket that Margaret had noticed the night before was nowhere to be found. It was as if whoever had removed Evelyn's gown had specifically taken that one piece of jewelry while leaving behind items of far greater monetary value. When Jonathan was awakened and brought downstairs, his reaction puzzled and disturbed the servants. Rather than the panic or desperation one might expect from a husband discovering his wife missing, he stood in the foyer for several long minutes, staring at the gown with an expression that Margaret later described as more fearful than surprised, as if he'd been expecting something terrible to happen. His face had gone pale, but it was the pallor of a man confronting a long-anticipated crisis rather than the shock of an unexpected tragedy. Even stranger was Jonathan's immediate reaction to the situation. Instead of demanding that the servants search the house or calling for the police, his first action was to send Charles Henley to fetch his private secretary, a nervous man named Arthur Peyton, who handled Jonathan's most sensitive business correspondence. His second action was to order Margaret to gather all of Evelyn's personal papers and journals from her study, ostensibly to help in the search for clues about her disappearance, but in a manner that seemed more concerned with controlling evidence than finding his missing wife. Dr. Franklin Westbrook arrived at the mansion within an hour of being summoned, but by then Jonathan had already taken control of the situation in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. The doctor was not asked to examine the scene or offer medical opinions about possible explanations for Evelyn's disappearance. Instead, he was ushered into Jonathan's private office for a conversation that lasted nearly 30 minutes, and from which he emerged looking deeply troubled and refusing to speak to anyone else about what had been discussed. The most chilling detail of all was discovered by Thomas Brennan during his careful examination of the mansion's exterior. While the snow around the house showed no signs of footprints, he found something far more disturbing near the entrance to the old ice house. There, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, were dark stains on the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. When Thomas attempted to investigate further, he was ordered away from the area by Jonathan himself, who claimed that the ice house was structurally unsafe and off limits to all household staff. The official investigation into Evelyn Hartwell's disappearance lasted exactly 6 days, a remarkably brief period for a case involving one of Pittsburgh's most prominent families. Detective Samuel Crawford, a 20-year veteran of the Pittsburgh Police Department, was assigned to the case, but found his efforts hampered at every turn by what he would later describe in his private notes as interference from parties unknown. Crawford was an honest cop in a city where honesty was often a luxury that law enforcement couldn't afford, and his dedication to uncovering the truth would ultimately cost him far more than his career. Crawford had built his reputation on meticulous investigation and an almost supernatural ability to uncover evidence that others missed. A tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating dark eyes, he had solved some of Pittsburgh's most challenging cases through sheer persistence and an unwillingness to accept convenient explanations that didn't fit the facts. But the Hartwell case would test every skill he had developed over 2 decades of police work, presenting him with a mystery that seemed to defy logical explanation while simultaneously revealing a conspiracy so vast and well protected that even acknowledging its existence put his life in danger. Crawford's initial interviews with the household staff revealed several disturbing details that never made it into the official police report. Margaret Sullivan confided that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Evelyn had been receiving mysterious visitors. Well-dressed men who arrived after dark and departed before dawn, entering through the mansion's service entrance to avoid being seen by neighbors or the main household staff. These meetings always took place in Evelyn's private study, and Margaret noted that after each visit, her mistress appeared increasingly agitated and fearful. The housekeeper's description of these nocturnal visitors was troubling in its specificity. They were always impeccably dressed in expensive suits and overcoats, spoke with educated accents that suggested upper-class backgrounds, and carried themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to wielding power. But what Margaret found most unsettling was their eyes. Cold, calculating gazes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings, as if assessing potential threats or escape routes. More troubling still was Thomas Brennan's observation that someone had been regularly visiting the estate's old ice house, a stone structure built into the hillside behind the mansion. The ice house hadn't been used for its original purpose in years, as the Hartwells had installed one of the city's first electric refrigeration systems in 1885. The structure itself was an impressive feat of engineering, built into the natural slope of the hill with walls 3 feet thick and a complex system of drainage channels designed to keep the interior dry and cool year-round. Brennan had noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading to and from the ice house on multiple occasions throughout November and early December. Always the prints of a woman's small boots that matched those found in Evelyn's closet. But more disturbing than the footprints themselves was their pattern. They suggested that someone had been making regular visits to the ice house, always at night and always alone. On several occasions, Thomas had seen a faint light glowing from within the structure, as if someone were using a lantern or candle to illuminate the interior. When Crawford attempted to question Thomas about these observations in detail, the groundskeeper revealed something even more unsettling. On at least 3 occasions, he had seen not just Evelyn's footprints leading to the ice house, but also the tracks of a much larger person. Someone wearing heavy boots of the type typically worn by workmen or laborers. These larger footprints always appeared on the same nights as Evelyn's visits, but they followed a different path, approaching the ice house from the direction of the public road, rather than from the mansion itself. Detective Crawford's attempts to search the ice house were blocked by Jonathan Hartwell himself, who claimed that the structure was unsafe and that a full structural inspection would be required before anyone could enter. This explanation struck Crawford as suspicious, given that the ice house had been built with the same attention to quality and durability that characterized all of the Hartwell estate's structures. When Crawford pressed for permission to conduct even a limited examination of the building's exterior, he was informed by Hartwell's lawyers that any investigation of the ice house would require a specific warrant that clearly articulated probable cause for believing evidence of a crime might be found within. The legal obstacles placed in Crawford's path were unlike anything he had encountered in his 2 decades of police work. Typically, families of missing persons were eager to cooperate with any investigation that might lead to their loved one's recovery. But the Hartwell case was different. From the very beginning, it seemed as if powerful forces were working to limit the scope of the investigation and prevent certain areas of inquiry from being pursued. When Crawford returned 3 days later, with the necessary permits and warrants, he found that the ice house had been sealed with fresh mortar, and Hartwell's lawyers argued that the detective's warrant was no longer valid due to substantial modifications to the structure. The speed with which this sealing had been accomplished was remarkable, requiring the work of skilled masons and a substantial quantity of building materials that must have been procured and transported to the estate within a matter of hours. Perhaps most significantly, Crawford discovered that Evelyn's private journal, the leather-bound book that servants had seen her writing in obsessively, was missing from her locked writing desk. The desk itself showed no signs of forced entry, and the only key was reportedly in Evelyn's possession when she disappeared. When questioned about the journal, Jonathan claimed to have no knowledge of such a book, despite Margaret Sullivan's sworn testimony that she had seen him reading from it on the morning of Evelyn's disappearance. The missing journal was particularly significant because several servants had described it as containing far more than typical personal reflections or social correspondence. Margaret Sullivan reported that Evelyn had been working on what appeared to be a systematic documentation of some kind, filling page after page with detailed notes, sketches, and what looked like business correspondence. The journal had been thick enough to contain several hundred pages, and Evelyn had been writing in it daily for at least 6 months before her disappearance. Crawford's investigation took on a new dimension when he began to explore Evelyn's background and family history. The Caldwell banking family, once prominent figures in New England society, had apparently suffered a series of financial disasters in recent years that had reduced them from wealth and influence to near poverty in less than 5 years. What made this decline particularly suspicious was its speed and the specific nature of the financial instruments that had caused their ruin. Evelyn's father, Harrison Caldwell, had died under mysterious circumstances in Boston in 1886, officially ruled a suicide by hanging, though no note was ever found, and family friends insisted that he had shown no signs of depression or financial despair. The Boston Police Department's file on Harrison Caldwell's death was remarkably thin, containing little more than a brief report describing the discovery of his body in his banking office and a cursory statement from the coroner attributing his death to suicide while of unsound mind. But Crawford's investigation revealed details about Harrison Caldwell's death that had never been included in the official Boston police report. A source within the Boston banking community informed Crawford that Harrison had been working on exposing a complex fraud scheme involving the manipulation of steel investments in the weeks before his death. This scheme allegedly involved a consortium of Pittsburgh industrialists who were using inside information about planned industrial accidents to manipulate steel prices and acquire competitors' assets at drastically reduced values. Even more disturbing was the fate of Evelyn's younger brother, Edmund Caldwell. Family friends claimed he had traveled to California to seek his fortune in late 1886, shortly after his father's death, though no one could provide specific details about his departure or his current whereabouts. Edmund had been a promising young attorney who had recently graduated from Harvard Law School and had been working with his father on investigating the financial irregularities that may have contributed to the family's ruin. Crawford's attempts to trace Edmund Caldwell's movements after leaving Boston revealed a troubling pattern. Railroad records showed that a young man matching Edmund's description had purchased a ticket to Chicago in November 1886, but there was no record of him continuing on to California. Hotel registries in Chicago showed that someone using the name E. Harrison had stayed at several different establishments during the winter of 1886 to 1887, always paying in cash and never remaining in one place for more than a few days. The detectives' investigation into the Caldwell family's financial ruin revealed a complex web of manipulated investments, fraudulent loans, and coordinated attacks on their business interests that bore all the hallmarks of a systematic campaign of destruction. The timing of these financial attacks coincided almost perfectly with Jonathan Hartwell's courtship of Evelyn, suggesting that her marriage might have been as much about eliminating a potential threat as it was about gaining social legitimacy for Hartwell's industrial empire. But perhaps the most chilling discovery Crawford made during his investigation into the Caldwell family was a pattern of similar financial attacks, targeting other prominent families throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states. In each case, the targeted families had either owned steel-related businesses, possessed information about steel industry practices, or had been involved in investigating labor conditions or industrial safety issues. And in each case, the family's destruction had been followed by the acquisition of their assets by companies that could be traced back to a small group of Pittsburgh industrialists. Crawford's private notes from this period reveal his growing realization that Evelyn Hartwell's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest in a series of eliminations designed to protect a conspiracy that had been operating for at least a decade. His investigation had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a secret organization of industrial leaders who had systematically murdered their way to dominance of America's steel industry, leaving behind a trail of convenient accidents, suicides, and disappearances that had never been connected by law enforcement agencies operating in different jurisdictions. The scope of this conspiracy was staggering in its ambition and ruthlessness. Crawford's research suggested that the Pittsburgh Circle, as he had begun calling the organization in his notes, had been responsible for the deaths of at least 37 people over the past 10 years, including business rivals, investigative journalists, labor organizers, and family members who had possessed dangerous knowledge about the group's activities. The methods employed ranged from staged industrial accidents and building fires to apparent suicides and mysterious disappearances that left no trace of the victims. 3 months after Evelyn's disappearance, Pittsburgh's industrial landscape was shaken by a series of unprecedented events that seemed at first glance unrelated to the Hartwell mystery. A massive explosion at the Consolidated Steel Works, a facility owned by Hartwell's primary competitor, industrialist Henry Rutherford, killed 17 workers and destroyed nearly half the factory. The explosion occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a bitter March morning, when only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers should have been present. But investigators later discovered that several key engineers and foremen had been working late that night on what Rutherford described as critical production modifications. The official investigation blamed a faulty boiler, but whispers throughout Pittsburgh's working class neighborhoods suggested sabotage. The pattern of destruction was unlike anything seen in previous industrial accidents, with the explosion appearing to have originated from multiple points simultaneously rather than from a single mechanical failure. More troubling still was the discovery that several of the factory's safety systems had been deliberately disabled in the hours before the explosion. Though this information was quickly suppressed by both company officials and local authorities, what made this tragedy particularly relevant to Evelyn's case was a discovery made by one of the surviving workers, an Irish immigrant named Patrick O'Connell. O'Connell had been working as a night watchman at the Consolidated Steel Works for over 3 years, and his duties included regular patrols of the entire facility to check for signs of fire, intruders, or mechanical problems. On the night of the explosion, he had noticed several unusual details that he later reported to Detective Crawford in secret. While helping to clear debris from the explosion site, O'Connell found a partially burned leather satchel hidden beneath a collapsed section of the factory's office building. The satchel contained documents that appeared to detail the structural weaknesses of several Pittsburgh steel mills, including precise engineering drawings and what looked like schedules for planned accidents. Most shocking of all, the handwriting on several of these documents was distinctly feminine, written in the same elegant script that Margaret Sullivan recognized from Evelyn's correspondence. The documents in the satchel represented months or even years of careful study and preparation. They included detailed floor plans of multiple industrial facilities throughout Pittsburgh and the surrounding region, annotated with notes about security procedures, shift schedules, and optimal timing for various types of sabotage. Some of the plans were accompanied by photographs that appeared to have been taken covertly from within the facilities, showing specific equipment and structural elements that would later be identified as the sources of accidental explosions or fires. O'Connell, perhaps naively, brought these documents to Detective Crawford, who by this time had been quietly continuing his investigation into Evelyn's disappearance despite official orders to close the case. The detective's examination of the papers revealed something that made his blood run cold. The documents contained detailed information about the Consolidated Steel Works vulnerabilities, information that could only have been obtained by someone with intimate knowledge of industrial espionage, or someone married to one of the industry's most powerful figures. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing than an evidence of sabotage. Several of the papers contained correspondence between someone identified only as EV and another person referred to as EH. The tone of these letters was conspiratorial and urgent, discussing plans to expose the circle and bring justice for father. The handwriting of the EV correspondent matched samples of Evelyn's writing that Crawford had obtained from the Hartwell household, while the EH letters were written in a masculine hand that suggested they came from someone with legal or academic training. More disturbing still was Crawford's discovery that the explosion at Consolidated Steel Works was not an isolated incident. Over the past 18 months, 7 different steel mills, coal mines, and manufacturing facilities throughout Pennsylvania had suffered mysterious accidents, fires, or explosions. In each case, the damaged facility was either owned by one of Jonathan Hartwell's competitors or had been targeted for acquisition by Hartwell's rapidly expanding business empire. The pattern of these incidents was so consistent that Crawford began to suspect they were part of a coordinated campaign of industrial terrorism designed to eliminate competition and terrorize potential rivals into submission. The timing of the incidents was particularly revealing, as they always occurred during periods when the targeted companies were experiencing financial difficulties or were involved in labor disputes that made them vulnerable to acquisition by larger competitors. Crawford's investigation into these patterns led him to a shocking revelation about the true scope of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. The organization was not simply eliminating individual competitors, but was systematically restructuring Pennsylvania's entire industrial economy to ensure their complete dominance of steel production, coal mining, and related industries. They had created what amounted to a shadow government of industrial leaders who controlled not just their own enterprises, but also key politicians, judges, police officials, and newspaper editors throughout the region. The detective's research revealed that the Pittsburgh Circle had been operating for at least 15 years, beginning as an informal alliance between 3 major steel producers who had recognized the advantages of coordinating their efforts to eliminate smaller competitors. Over time, the organization had grown to include coal mine owners, railroad executives, banking officials, and even prominent lawyers and politicians who provided legal protection and political cover for the group's increasingly violent activities. What made the Pittsburgh Circle particularly dangerous was their sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate both public opinion and law enforcement. They owned several newspapers throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, allowing them to control how industrial accidents were reported and investigated. They had cultivated relationships with key figures in local and state government, ensuring that investigations into their activities would be limited in scope and quickly closed without meaningful findings. Most importantly, they had developed a network of operatives, former soldiers, private detectives, and hired killers who could carry out their orders while leaving no traceable connections to the Circle's leadership. Crawford's investigation into Evelyn's family history revealed that her father, Harrison Caldwell, had stumbled upon evidence of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities while investigating irregularities in steel industry investments for his Boston banking clients. Harrison had been preparing to expose the conspiracy when he was murdered in his office, with his death staged to look like suicide. The same fate had apparently been planned for Edmund Caldwell, but the young attorney had managed to escape Boston before the Circle's operatives could eliminate him. The detective's private notes from this period reveal his growing understanding that Evelyn had somehow learned about her family's true fate and had been conducting her own investigation into the Pittsburgh Circle from within her marriage to one of its founding members. The mysterious late-night visitors to the Hartwell mansion were likely co-conspirators in this investigation, possibly including her brother Edmund, who may have been working with a small group of reformist journalists and honest law enforcement officials to gather evidence against the conspiracy. But Crawford's most chilling discovery came when he traced the ownership records of several properties that had been purchased by shell companies connected to Hartwell's business interests. One of these properties was a remote farmhouse in Westmoreland County, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The property had been purchased in 1886, shortly after Evelyn's marriage to Jonathan began showing signs of strain, and had been maintained as a private retreat away from the scrutiny of Pittsburgh's social elite. When Crawford discreetly visited the property in late April 1888, he found signs of recent habitation that suggested someone had been living there intermittently over the past several months. The farmhouse was modest but comfortable, furnished with the kind of simple elegance that suggested it was intended as a refuge rather than a primary residence. But what struck the detective as most significant was the obvious care that had been taken to make the property defensible. Heavy shutters on all windows, reinforced doors, and what appeared to be hidden passages connecting different rooms of the house. In the house's small study, Crawford discovered what appeared to have been the operational center for an extensive investigation into the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. The walls were covered with maps of Pennsylvania, showing the locations of industrial accidents, newspaper clippings detailing unexplained explosions and fires, and detailed family trees connecting Pittsburgh's industrial elite. Most damning of all was a large chart that Crawford later described as a web of corruption, showing how Hartwell's empire had grown through the systematic destruction of his competitors. The study also contained an extensive collection of photographs, documents, and correspondence that provided overwhelming evidence of the Pittsburgh Circle's criminal activities. There were detailed financial records showing how the organization had manipulated steel prices through coordinated production shutdowns and artificial scarcity. There were copies of correspondence between Circle members discussing specific targets for elimination and the methods to be employed. Most disturbing of all were photographs of several Circle meetings, apparently taken covertly, that showed Jonathan Hartwell and other prominent industrialists planning what could only be described as acts of terrorism against their competitors. But the farmhouse held an even more disturbing secret. In the cellar, hidden behind a false wall that Crawford discovered purely by accident, when he noticed inconsistencies in the room's dimensions, was a small chamber containing dozens of additional photographs and documents. These materials provided evidence that the Pittsburgh Circle's activities extended far beyond industrial sabotage into political assassination, judicial corruption, and the systematic elimination of journalists and labor leaders who threatened their interests. Among these photographs was one that made Crawford's hands shake as he held it. The image showed the interior of the Consolidated Steel Works boiler room, with specific structural points marked in red ink and notes written in Evelyn's handwriting describing optimal placement for maximum impact. The date on the photograph was November 15, 1887, less than a month before Evelyn's disappearance, and nearly 4 months before the explosion that killed 17 workers. The implications of this photograph were staggering. It suggested that Evelyn had not only discovered the Pittsburgh Circle's plans for the Consolidated Steel Works attack, but had actually participated in its planning and execution. But Crawford's careful examination of the other documents in the hidden chamber revealed a more complex and tragic truth. Evelyn had indeed been involved in planning the explosion, but not as a willing participant in the Pittsburgh Circle's campaign of terror. Additional correspondence found in the chamber revealed that Evelyn had been coerced into providing intelligence about competitor facilities under threat of harm to her missing brother Edmund. The Circle had been using Edmund's life as leverage to force Evelyn's cooperation in their sabotage operations, while simultaneously using her marriage to Jonathan to provide cover for their activities. But Evelyn had been secretly documenting everything, building a comprehensive case against the organization, while appearing to cooperate with their demands. Crawford's investigation took an even darker turn when he discovered correspondence between Evelyn and a man identified only by the initials E.H., initials that matched those of her supposedly missing brother, Edmund Caldwell. These letters, hidden in a hollowed out book in the farmhouse library, revealed that Edmund was very much alive, but living under an assumed identity, while helping his sister gather evidence against the Pittsburgh Circle. The letters detailed a complex plan to expose the conspiracy, while ensuring the safety of both siblings and other potential witnesses. But the final letter in the collection, dated December 10, 1887, just 2 days before Evelyn's disappearance, contained a message that chilled Crawford to the bone. Our father's death was not suicide. Jay knows we have discovered the truth about the Circle. They plan to eliminate both of us within days. I have hidden copies of all evidence in multiple locations. If something happens to me, remember our childhood hiding place. The truth waits there. Do not trust anyone in Pittsburgh. The corruption reaches into the highest levels of government. Trust only the contact in Chicago whose name I gave you. Time is running out. E.V. The letter was accompanied by a detailed map of the Hartwell estate with specific locations marked for what appeared to be hidden caches of evidence. Most significant was a marking at the old ice house, indicating that additional documentation was concealed somewhere within that structure. Crawford realized that Evelyn's regular visits to the ice house had not been meetings with co-conspirators, but rather trips to hide evidence that would eventually expose the Pittsburgh Circle's crimes. As Crawford pieced together the full scope of Evelyn's investigation, he began to understand the true courage and determination that had driven her final months. She had discovered that her marriage was part of a conspiracy that had murdered her father and destroyed her family. But instead of fleeing or seeking protection, she had chosen to use her position as Jonathan's wife to gather evidence that could bring down the entire organization. She had been playing an incredibly dangerous game, appearing to cooperate with the Circle's demands, while secretly documenting their crimes and planning their ultimate exposure. But Crawford's investigation was about to take an even more dangerous turn. As he prepared to retrieve the evidence hidden in the Hartwell estate's ice house, he began to notice signs that his own activities were being monitored. Strange men appeared outside his boarding house at odd hours. His mail seemed to have been opened and resealed. Witnesses who had previously been willing to speak with him suddenly became evasive or claimed to have no memory of their earlier conversations. Just when Crawford thought he had begun to understand the scope of the conspiracy, his investigation was abruptly terminated. On a rainy April morning in 1888, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind Pittsburgh Central Police Station. Officially ruled a heart attack brought on by excessive drinking. But Crawford's wife later testified that her husband rarely drank and had been in excellent health. More suspicious still was the fact that all of Crawford's case files related to the Hartwell investigation disappeared from the police station on the same night he died. The detective's death marked the end of any official investigation into Evelyn Hartwell's disappearance. But it also represented something far more sinister. Proof that the Pittsburgh Circle was willing to murder law enforcement officials to protect their secrets. Crawford's death sent a clear message to other honest cops and potential investigators that some cases were too dangerous to pursue, no matter how compelling the evidence might be. In the months following Detective Crawford's death, Pittsburgh's industrial elite seemed to close ranks even more tightly, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated every level of society. Workers in the steel mills whispered about mysterious accidents that claimed the lives of anyone who spoke to openly about safety violations or labor organizing. Journalists found that editors were suddenly unwilling to publish stories that might reflect poorly on the city's major industrial leaders. Even politicians who had previously supported labor reforms began to change their positions, often citing vague concerns about economic stability and the need to maintain Pittsburgh's competitive advantage in national markets. But beneath this surface calm, forces were stirring that would eventually bring the Pittsburgh Circle's crimes into the light. The detectives' investigation, though officially terminated, had created ripples that extended far beyond Pittsburgh's borders. Crawford had corresponded with law enforcement officials in other cities, sharing information about industrial accidents and mysterious disappearances that seemed to follow similar patterns. These contacts had begun their own quiet investigations, carefully avoiding the mistakes that had cost Crawford his life. In Boston, Police Captain William O'Brien had become intrigued by Crawford's inquiries about the Caldwell family's destruction and Harrison Caldwell's alleged suicide. O'Brien was a 25-year veteran of the Boston Police Department who had always been troubled by the cursory nature of the investigation into Harrison's death. The banker had been found hanging in his office with no suicide note and no apparent motive for taking his own life. Yet the case had been closed within days, despite numerous inconsistencies in the physical evidence. O'Brien's review of the original case files revealed several details that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by the original investigators. Harrison Caldwell's office had shown signs of a struggle, with furniture overturned and papers scattered across the floor. Yet this had been dismissed as the result of the suicide victim's final moments of desperation. More troubling was the testimony of a night watchman who claimed to have seen 3 well-dressed men leaving the building around the time Harrison's body was discovered, but whose statement had never been included in the official police report. The Boston police captain's investigation led him to attempt contact with Edmund Caldwell, who had supposedly traveled to California, but whose actual whereabouts remained unknown. O'Brien's inquiries through Western law enforcement agencies produced no trace of anyone matching Edmund's description, arriving in California during the relevant time period. But they did reveal something even more intriguing. Reports of a young attorney, using various aliases, who had been asking questions about industrial corruption and financial manipulation in several major cities throughout the Midwest. Meanwhile, in Chicago, investigative seminary in Virginia, investigative journalist Michael Flanagan had become interested in Crawford's research into the patterns of industrial accidents throughout Pennsylvania. Flanagan worked for the Chicago Tribune and had built a reputation for exposing corporate corruption and political graft that extended throughout the Midwest's rapidly growing industrial centers. His own investigation into steel industry practices had revealed disturbing patterns that seemed to confirm Crawford's suspicions about coordinated sabotage and market manipulation. Flanagan's research had uncovered evidence of similar conspiracies operating in other industrial centers throughout the country. In Cleveland, a group of steel and shipping magnates appeared to be using methods remarkably similar to those employed by the Pittsburgh Circle. In Detroit, the emerging automobile industry showed signs of manipulation by a coalition of industrialists who seemed to coordinate their activities through secret meetings and coded correspondence. The pattern suggested that the Pittsburgh Circle was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather part of a larger network of criminal organizations that were systematically taking control of America's industrial economy. But Flanagan's most significant discovery came when he managed to make contact with the mysterious E.H., who had been corresponding with Evelyn Hartwell. Through a complex series of intermediaries and coded messages, Flanagan arranged a clandestine meeting with Edmund Caldwell, who was indeed alive and living under an assumed identity in Chicago. What Edmund revealed during that meeting would fundamentally change Flanagan's understanding of the scope and danger of the conspiracy they were attempting to expose. Edmund had been living in constant fear for his life since fleeing Boston after his father's murder. He had changed his identity multiple times, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks, and had been forced to abandon any hope of practicing law or maintaining normal social relationships. But throughout his exile, he had continued the investigation that had cost his father his life, gathering evidence about the Pittsburgh Circle and similar organizations operating throughout the country. What Edmund had discovered was far more terrifying than even Crawford had suspected. The Pittsburgh Circle was indeed part of a larger network, but the scope of this network extended into the highest levels of American business and government. Members of the conspiracy included not just industrial leaders, but also bankers, railroad executives, newspaper publishers, judges, senators, and even cabinet members in the federal government. They had created what amounted to a shadow government that controlled key aspects of American economic policy and used systematic violence to eliminate anyone who threatened their power. Edmund's evidence included detailed documentation of how this conspiracy had manipulated the Panic of 1873, engineering a financial crisis that allowed them to acquire distressed assets at a fraction of their true value. They had orchestrated labor strikes and industrial violence to justify the use of federal troops against workers' organizations. They had even influenced foreign policy decisions, pushing for tariffs and trade agreements that benefited their industrial empires at the expense of American consumers and workers. But perhaps most shocking of all was Edmund's revelation about his sister's fate. Evelyn had not simply disappeared on December 12, 1887. She had been murdered by Jonathan Hartwell himself, with the assistance of other Circle members, after she threatened to expose their crimes to federal authorities. But before her death, she had managed to hide comprehensive evidence of the conspiracy in multiple locations, creating what Edmund described as an insurance policy that would ensure their crimes would eventually be exposed, even if both siblings were eliminated. The evidence that Evelyn had gathered included not just documentation of specific crimes, but also detailed information about the conspiracy's organizational structure, financial operations, and future plans. She had photographed secret meetings, copied confidential correspondence, and even recorded conversations using one of the new phonograph devices that were becoming available to wealthy consumers. Most importantly, she had identified other victims of the conspiracy who might be willing to testify if they could be assured of protection from retaliation. Edmund's meeting with Flanagan took place in an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side, chosen specifically because it offered multiple escape routes and could be observed for signs of surveillance. The young attorney had become expert at such precautions during his months of exile, but even his careful preparations could not entirely eliminate the risks involved in exposing such a powerful and ruthless organization. During their conversation, Edmund revealed that he and Evelyn had developed an elaborate plan to bring down the Pittsburgh Circle by simultaneously releasing evidence to law enforcement agencies, newspapers, and political leaders in multiple cities. They had recognized that the conspiracy's power was based largely on their ability to control information and eliminate threats before they could gain public attention. By coordinating a simultaneous release of evidence in dozens of locations, they hoped to prevent the conspiracy from suppressing the revelations or eliminating all the witnesses. But their plan had been discovered before it could be implemented. Jonathan had somehow learned about Evelyn's activities and had confronted her on the night of December 12th. What followed was not the civilized discussion that Evelyn had hoped for, but rather a brutal confrontation that ended with her murder and the systematic destruction of most of the evidence she had gathered. Edmund's voice shook with emotion as he described his sister's final message to him, delivered through a coded telegram that reached him just hours before her death. She had warned him that their plan had been compromised and that he should immediately implement the emergency procedures they had developed for just such a contingency. But by the time he received the message, it was already too late to save his sister, and he had been forced to choose between attempting a rescue that would likely result in both their deaths and preserving the evidence that might eventually bring their killers to justice. The journalist's meeting with Edmund was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the warehouse corridor, followed by the unmistakable click of revolvers being cocked. Both men realized simultaneously that their carefully planned security measures had been insufficient to prevent discovery by the conspiracy's agents. As they prepared for what seemed likely to be their final moments, Edmund pressed a small leather portfolio into Flanagan's hands, whispering urgently that it contained the locations of Evelyn's hidden evidence caches and the names of other witnesses who might be willing to testify. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Pittsburgh intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this deadly game of cat and mouse between truth and power. What followed was a desperate chase through the darkened streets of Chicago, with Edmund and Flanagan barely escaping their pursuers through a combination of luck, local knowledge, and the help of sympathetic workers who had their own reasons for opposing the industrial conspiracy. But even as they escaped immediate capture, both men knew that their lives had been forever changed by this encounter. They were now marked men, hunted by an organization with virtually unlimited resources and a demonstrated willingness to kill anyone who threatened their power. The implications of their narrow escape were clear. The Pittsburgh Circle's reach extended far beyond Pennsylvania's borders, and their network of agents and informants was sophisticated enough to track and locate their enemies, even in distant cities. Edmund realized that his months of careful hiding had provided only temporary safety, and that his sister's death had marked the beginning of a new phase in the conspiracy's efforts to eliminate all traces of their crimes. Flanagan, for his part, understood that he now possessed information that could either expose one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history or cost him his life if he handled it incorrectly. The leather portfolio that Edmund had given him contained not just evidence of past crimes, but also detailed plans for future operations that could affect the lives of thousands of workers and the economic stability of entire regions. The confrontation that would seal Evelyn Hartwell's fate began at exactly 11:47 p.m. on December 12, 1887, when Jonathan entered her study without knocking. A breach of the courteous distance they had maintained for months. Evelyn looked up from her writing to find her husband standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury that she had never seen before. Behind him stood two other men she recognized from social gatherings, fellow members of what she now knew was called the Pittsburgh Circle. "Did you really think I wouldn't discover your little investigation?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying a quiet menace that was far more terrifying than shouting would have been. In his hand, he held copies of the photographs she had taken, the documents she had stolen, and most damning of all, the correspondence with her brother Edmund. "You've been very clever, my dear wife, but not clever enough." What followed was a final desperate gambit, as Evelyn realized that her months of careful planning had been discovered. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that her evidence was safely hidden and that Edmund would continue their work even if she didn't survive. But knowing and facing the reality were two different things entirely. The truth about Evelyn Hartwell's fate would remain hidden for over 3 decades, sealed behind brick and mortar in the darkness of her own home. It would take an unexpected discovery in 1921 to finally bring the dark secrets of Pittsburgh's industrial elite back into the light. A revelation that came not through the efforts of law enforcement or investigative journalism, but through the simple act of renovation that would transform one of Pittsburgh's most infamous buildings. The years between 1888 and 1921 passed like a heavy silence over Pittsburgh's industrial district. The Pittsburgh Circle continued their operations with even greater secrecy, their power consolidated by the elimination of their most dangerous threats. Jonathan Hartwell grew wealthier and more influential, eventually serving on the boards of major banks and railroad companies throughout the Northeast. To all outward appearances, he was the picture of industrial success, a self-made man who had built an empire through innovation and determination. But those closest to him noticed changes. Servants whispered that he had grown cold and paranoid, installing new locks and security measures throughout the mansion. He never remarried, claiming that the loss of his beloved Evelyn had broken his heart. The irony of this public grief, performed for a woman he had murdered, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deception. During renovation of the old Hartwell mansion in 1921, which had been sold following Jonathan's death in 1903 and had served various purposes, including a private club for steel executives, construction workers discovered a sealed chamber behind the library's oak paneling. The discovery was made purely by accident when workers noticed that the library's dimensions didn't match the external measurements of the building. Inside this hidden room, they found what appeared to be Evelyn's complete archive of evidence against her husband and his associates. The chamber was approximately 8 by 12 feet, with shelves lining every wall and a small desk positioned near a concealed ventilation system that had kept the air breathable and the documents preserved despite decades of abandonment. The room had been designed as both a secure storage facility and a potential refuge, with a hidden entrance that could be accessed through a rotating section of the library's bookshelf. The chamber contained over 200 documents, photographs, and personal correspondence that painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder disguised as industrial accidents. Evelyn had spent months meticulously documenting how Jonathan and the Pittsburgh Circle had orchestrated the deaths of dozens of competitors, labor organizers, and anyone else who threatened their monopolistic control over Pennsylvania's industrial wealth. The documentation was so comprehensive and detailed that it would have been sufficient to secure criminal convictions against dozens of prominent figures if it had been discovered during their lifetimes. Among the most damning evidence were detailed financial records showing how Circle members had profited from advanced knowledge of planned accidents of competitor facilities. The documents revealed a sophisticated system of insider trading that allowed Circle members to sell stocks in companies just before those companies suffered mysterious explosions or fires. The profits from these trades were then used to fund the organization's operational expenses, including payments to corrupt officials and the salaries of the operatives who carried out their violent schemes. The archive also contained photographic evidence of Circle meetings, apparently taken by Evelyn using a concealed camera during social gatherings at the Hartwell mansion. These images showed prominent Pittsburgh industrialists, political leaders, and law enforcement officials planning specific acts of sabotage and discussing the elimination of individuals who posed a threat to their organization. The clarity and detail of these photographs made it impossible to dismiss them as forgeries or misinterpretations. But the most shocking discovery was Evelyn's final journal entry, written on December 12, 1887. The night of her disappearance. The journal was bound in red leather and filled with Evelyn's careful handwriting, documenting her growing understanding of her husband's crimes and her determination to bring him to justice regardless of the personal cost. The final entry was written in an obviously shaking hand, suggesting that Evelyn was composing it under extreme stress or fear. In it, she described how she had confronted Jonathan with her evidence earlier that evening, demanding that he cease his murderous activities and make amends to the families of his victims. She had believed, perhaps naively, that her husband retained enough humanity to be horrified by the revelation of what his ambition had cost in human lives. Instead, Jonathan's response had been swift and brutal, revealing a coldness that she had never suspected despite their years of marriage. He told me that I had served my purpose, Evelyn wrote in her shaking handwriting. That my family's destruction had been merely the first step in demonstrating the consequences of opposing him. He said that my marriage had been nothing more than a business transaction, a way to gain legitimacy in Boston's financial circles while destroying potential rivals. But now, he said, I had become a liability that could no longer be tolerated. The journal revealed that Jonathan had given Evelyn a choice that was no choice at all: disappear quietly and live in exile under a new identity, accepting the deaths of her father and the destruction of her family as the price of her own survival, or face the same fate as the dozens of other victims of the Pittsburgh Circle. But Evelyn had prepared for this moment throughout the months of her investigation, and her response demonstrated both her courage and her determination to ensure that justice would eventually be served. working with her brother Edmund, who had indeed been secretly living in Chicago under an assumed identity. She had developed an elaborate plan to fake her own death, while ensuring that evidence of the conspiracy would eventually be discovered. The plan involved using the mansion's hidden passages to stage her disappearance while actually remaining concealed within the building long enough to complete her documentation of the conspiracy's crimes. The emerald gown left in the foyer had been a deliberate misdirection, intended to suggest supernatural circumstances while actually concealing a very human plan for survival and eventual justice. On the night of December 12th, Evelyn had used a system of hidden passages within the mansion, passages that she had discovered during her investigation and that Jonathan had used to secretly meet with his co-conspirators. These passages, accessible through hidden panels in the mansion's walls, connected to maintenance tunnels that had been built during the mansion's construction to allow servants to move through the building without being seen by the family or their guests. But Evelyn's plan had a fatal flaw that she could not have anticipated. She had underestimated not just the ruthlessness of her husband and his associates, but also their detailed knowledge of the mansion's hidden architecture. The secret passages that she had believed would provide her escape route had actually been designed and built under Jonathan's direct supervision, and he was intimately familiar with every concealed entrance and exit in the building. Her journal's final entry revealed that just as she was preparing to escape through the hidden passages, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her study. Footsteps that belonged not to servants or household staff, but to several men whose voices she recognized as members of the Pittsburgh Circle. Realizing that Jonathan had discovered her plan and summoned his associates to deal with the threat she represented, she made a desperate decision to hide her evidence in the sealed chamber behind the library before attempting to flee. The journal entry broke off abruptly in the middle of a sentence, but the physical evidence found in the chamber told the rest of the story. Evelyn had managed to seal herself inside the hidden room with her archive of evidence, apparently hoping that she could wait out the immediate danger and escape later when the mansion was less heavily guarded. But her hiding place had become her tomb when Jonathan and his associates discovered her location and decided to eliminate both her and her evidence permanently. The workers who discovered Evelyn's hidden chamber in 1921 found more than just documents and photographs. In the far corner of the room, concealed beneath a pile of moth-eaten curtains and partially collapsed wooden shelving, they discovered human remains. The skeletal remains of a woman still wearing fragments of an emerald silk gown and jewelry that matched descriptions of Evelyn's personal effects. A locket found with the remains contained a photograph of Harrison Caldwell and an inscription that read, "D. To my beloved daughter Evelyn, may you always fight for justice, no matter the cost. Father." The discovery of Evelyn's remains and her comprehensive archive of evidence finally brought the Pittsburgh Circle's crimes into the light of day. Federal investigators were called in to examine the evidence and determine the full scope of the conspiracy that had been operating for decades. What they uncovered was far more extensive than even Detective Crawford had suspected. The conspiracy's influence had extended far beyond Pennsylvania's borders, with similar organizations operating in most major industrial centers throughout the United States. The federal investigation uncovered evidence of coordination between these groups, suggesting that they had formed a nationwide network of criminal organizations that had systematically corrupted American industrial development for decades. The scope of their influence was staggering, affecting everything from labor relations and industrial safety standards to foreign trade policy and federal legislation. Edmund Caldwell, now living under the name Edward Harrison in Los Angeles, was contacted by federal investigators and confirmed many of the details found in his sister's archive. He revealed that he and Evelyn had been working with a small group of reformist journalists and honest law enforcement officials to expose the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. But that one by one their allies had met with mysterious accidents or simply disappeared, leaving the siblings to continue their dangerous investigation alone. Evelyn knew she was walking into a trap that night. Edmund told investigators in 1921, his voice still heavy with emotion after 3 decades of exile and fear. But she believed that her evidence would eventually be found and that justice would be served. Even if it took decades. She was willing to sacrifice herself to ensure that the truth would survive and that our father's death would not be in vain. Edmund's testimony provided crucial corroboration for the evidence found in the hidden chamber, and his detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's operations allowed federal investigators to identify other victims and uncover additional evidence that had been hidden in locations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. His survival had been made possible only by his decision to abandon his legal career and assume a completely new identity, living in constant fear while slowly building a new life far from the reach of his sister's killers. The federal investigation also revealed the fate of Detective Samuel Crawford, whose death in 1888 had effectively ended the original investigation into Evelyn's disappearance. Crawford had indeed been murdered by Circle operatives, poisoned with a substance that mimicked the effects of heart failure, while leaving no obvious traces of foul play. His case files had been destroyed, not just to eliminate evidence of the conspiracy, but also to prevent other honest cops from continuing his investigation. The investigation into Crawford's death led to the discovery of his personal notes, which had been hidden by his widow in defiance of threats from unknown parties who had demanded their destruction. These notes provided additional confirmation of the conspiracy's scope and methods, and revealed that Crawford had been much closer to exposing the truth than anyone had realized at the time of his death. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the federal investigation was the exposure of corruption that extended into the highest levels of government. Several prominent senators, congressmen, and federal judges were implicated in the conspiracy, either as active participants or as recipients of bribes that had purchased their silence and cooperation. The resulting scandal led to the largest corruption investigation in American history up to that time, and resulted in the resignation or removal of dozens of public officials. The Hartwell mansion was demolished in 1923, officially due to structural problems, but more likely to eliminate any remaining evidence of the crimes committed within its walls. The site was eventually converted into a small park, with a modest memorial honoring the victims of industrial violence during Pittsburgh's early industrial period. The memorial made no specific mention of Evelyn Hartwell or the Pittsburgh Circle, reflecting the continued influence of powerful families who preferred that certain aspects of their history remain forgotten. Jonathan Hartwell's business empire was quietly dismantled following the federal investigation, with assets distributed among various shell companies and trusts that obscured their connection to the original conspiracy. Many of the families connected to the Pittsburgh Circle continued to wield enormous influence in American industry throughout the 20th century. Their dark origins, carefully hidden behind layers of legitimate business ventures and philanthropic activities that helped rehabilitate their public images. The steel industry itself underwent significant reforms following the exposure of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. New federal safety regulations were implemented. Labor unions gained legal protections that had been denied for decades. Oversight mechanisms were established to prevent the kind of systematic violence and corruption that had characterized the industry's early development. These changes came too late to help the hundreds of workers who had died in the conspiracy's engineered accidents, but they helped ensure that such systematic violence would be much more difficult to conceal in the future. The exposure of the Pittsburgh Circle also led to important changes in law enforcement and journalism. Federal agencies gained new powers to investigate interstate criminal conspiracies, and newspapers developed more sophisticated methods for protecting sources and investigating corporate corruption. The case became a touchstone for investigative journalists throughout the 20th century, demonstrating both the importance of persistent investigation and the extreme dangers faced by those who attempted to expose powerful criminal organizations. But Evelyn's sacrifice was not entirely in vain. The partial exposure of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities led to increased oversight of industrial safety and labor practices throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Labor organizations, armed with evidence of systematic violence against workers, were able to push through important safety regulations and worker protection laws that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. The conspiracy's methods of manipulation and violence became much more difficult to employ as public awareness grew and oversight mechanisms were strengthened. The evidence that Evelyn had risked everything to preserve also inspired a new generation of reformers and investigative journalists who continued the fight for industrial justice throughout the early 20th century. Her determination to document the truth, even at the cost of her own life, became a powerful symbol of the individual courage required to confront institutional corruption and violence. The story of Evelyn Hartwell also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by women who attempted to challenge powerful male-dominated institutions during the late 19th century. Her ability to gather evidence about the Pittsburgh Circle was largely dependent on her access to her husband's business affairs. Access that could be revoked at any moment, and that placed her in constant danger of discovery and retaliation. Her courage in using that privileged position to expose crimes rather than simply enjoying the benefits of wealth and status demonstrated a moral commitment that transcended the conventional expectations of her social class and gender. This mystery shows us how power and greed can corrupt even the most intimate relationships, transforming marriage from a partnership based on love and trust into a weapon for manipulation and control. Evelyn Hartwell disappeared into the darkness of that December night in 1887. But her determination to reveal the truth ultimately outlived her murderers and brought a measure of justice to their victims. Even if that justice came 3 decades too late, the case also demonstrates how individual acts of courage can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. Evelyn's investigation, conducted in secret and at enormous personal risk, provided the foundation for reforms that affected the lives of thousands of workers and helped establish precedents for federal oversight of corporate crime that continue to influence American law enforcement today. Perhaps most importantly, Evelyn's story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice often requires ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices in the face of overwhelming power and institutionalized corruption. Her willingness to risk everything to expose the truth about her husband's crimes, even knowing that discovery would likely cost her life, represents the kind of moral courage that has driven progress throughout American history. The mystery of Evelyn Hartwell's disappearance was ultimately solved not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensic science, but through the simple passage of time and the inevitable decay of the physical structures that had concealed the truth. Her voice, silenced by violence in 1887, finally spoke again in 1921, ensuring that her sacrifice would not be forgotten and that the victims of the Pittsburgh circle would receive the justice that had been denied them for over 3 decades. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets hidden in the shadows of America's industrial past? Could similar conspiracies exist today, using modern technology and global reach to eliminate threats and manipulate markets? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about the Pittsburgh Circle and whether such organized corporate violence could still be operating in our contemporary world. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between historical fact and terrifying possibility. See you in the next one.